Okay, we'll start with the prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Congrats on making it to the end. This is the last of our four-part series. And we'll start with a reading from the Gospel of St. Matthew. This is chapter 8, verse 23. He got into a boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a violent storm came up on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. They came and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." He said to them, "Why are you terrified, O you of little faith?" Then he got up, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm. The men were amazed and said, "What sort of man is this, whom even the winds and the sea obey?" So there was once a man who, even before his first communion at the age of 9, lost his mom. His older sister died shortly thereafter, and then his brother when he was 12. He survived the brutal invasion of the Nazis into Poland with only his father at his side, who soon died a few years later. So now he was left alone, working in a stone quarry and then a chemical plant under German occupation, only later to join a secret underground seminary. This was all before he was 23 years of age. He later became a priest and then a bishop, but not under the Nazis this time, but under a communist rule. And then he eventually became pope. So you may know who I'm talking about. This man was Karol Wojtyła. I always get that wrong. Karol Wojtyła, otherwise known as John Paul II. And on October 22nd, 1978, this man, John Paul II, looked out into the massive crowd gathered at St. Peter's Square in Rome, and he gave a rousing homily to begin his pontificate. It was his solemn inauguration. So basically, he was being installed as Pope. And do you know what his famous words were? This man who lived through the tumultuous 20th century, which claimed 20 million lives just from World War I. And then World War II claimed 85 million lives. Countless others from disease and other dictators, totalitarian regimes. It was the worst century on record. And you know what he said in the bookend to all of that? To the whole crowd? He said, "Do not be afraid." Do not be afraid. That was his message. He, of all people, should be able to say that with conviction, right? And he used this throughout his pontificate, but he's not the only one to use those words. He certainly wasn't the first. So phrases like, "fear not" and "be not afraid" are found all over the Bible. So Abraham hears this in a vision from God. Moses told the Israelite people that same thing in the face of the Egyptians. Joshua was told not to fear the nations which stood in their way of the promised land. Joseph was told not to be afraid to take Mary as his wife. And Mary was also told not to be afraid because she had found favor with God. And then finally, but certainly not last or least, Jesus himself tells the disciples, "Do not fear," not to be afraid. And there are hundreds of other examples. In fact, do you know how many times the Bible has "do not fear" or "fear not" or that type of phrase? 365 times. Once for every day of the year. I didn't count them, but I looked it up. So it seemed pretty credible. Once for every day of the year, 365 times. But have we gotten the message? For the past few months, what fills the air is precisely that. Fear, anxiety, worry. And it really alarms me that the danger is not so much with the virus, but this paralysis that we have, with this fear that we found. So tonight I want to talk about this ugly disorder, going back to the first week. This ugly disposition of our soul that may have reared its head in the coronavirus. And suggest the Christian response to these things. So if we go back to Italy, in late January, this is where I first heard of the virus. So at first it was an interesting story for all the seminarians to follow. It piqued our collective interest. But the more we realized how close it was coming and the more people it affected, the more our interest turned to fear. And I'm ashamed to say it. It's like a hurricane when you're young. It's exciting, or at least it was for me. I love tracking the weather. I like getting out of school. It was like, there was something in the air that wasn't there usually. Until you look on your dad's face and he has to board up the house, and then you realize that you may not have a house when you get back from your uncle's house in Mississippi, right? So our interest turned to concern, and our concern turned to downright fear, unfortunately. And before I go any further, I want to make a statement. I'm not saying that this is not serious in any way. I mean, this is a very, very serious thing, and we should absolutely take precautions as the authorities say so. Absolutely. But I do want to explore and understand some of the reactions that many of us and many of the people outside in the world especially have had. So for example, my neighbor in Rome, the guy who lives on the side of me, and the walls are really thin. Super faithful guy, and he's from the Northeast, so he'll never see this. Rather than the Midwest. I could hear him around the clock calling his mom, his dad, his aunt, his uncle, you name it. I'm telling you, around the clock. So I wasn't eavesdropping. I had to sleep at some point, And he wanted out. He thought Armageddon was coming. He thought he was going to die. Constant, just this. A super faithful guy who 3 weeks before was just at peace. Everything was fine. And then this hits, and he wants out. And he wasn't alone. So there were other guys who made group texts with their friends, and instead of paying attention in class, their phones were just blowing up constantly with the newest sensational headline about how Armageddon was headed our way. Lunch and dinner was filled with who could offer the most sensational headline that they read during the day. It was awful. You get the picture. So instead of a measured approach to continuing formation, prayer, study, healthy community, we had a frenzy. We had accusations of government leadership, whether they're doing the right thing or not. Division, manipulation of facts, discord, which are all key ploys of the enemy. That's the best thing that he can use. It was a genuine fear, or even worse, it was a built-up false anxiety. It was everywhere. And unfortunately, I came home in March to the same thing. So I went from one frying pan to the next. And unfortunately, it wasn't much better here. Something was off in my community back in Rome, and there was something off here. So what was off? Why do I say something was off? Isn't this fear warranted? So back in Rome, many of us passed the Colosseum every day to get to school. We live within a stone's throw of the Vatican, which used to be where Nero's circus was. I don't know if you know that. Both of these places are locations of brutal just tactics against Christians. These are places where Christian blood was spilled, but it's also where Christianity shines. So if you've heard the saying, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, they mean that quite literally. Where Nero's circus used to be is now St. Peter's Basilica, Vatican City. And as soon as you walk into Vatican City, or into St. Peter's Basilica rather, and you look up at the big rotunda, you see 40 men. These are 40 popes. You know what they all had in common? They were all martyred. Many of them right there. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And many times walking around Rome, or when you're a child and you're reading these great stories of the saints, you can say, gosh, I wish I could do that. One day I will do that. I will be as heroic as those saints. I'll die for the name of Christ like those first century martyrs. And then what happens? A tiny invisible virus, can't even see, comes. And oftentimes our faith takes a backseat to what? To fear. This shouldn't be. The Christian should be different. Because the Christian sees the world in a way that others do not see it. The Christian has tools that should be in play. And tonight I want to talk about some of those tools. So to be Christian is to fear nothing, not even death, at least in the correct proportion, and we'll talk about that. That's a bold statement, but it's true. So people fear many things. Small things like roaches and spiders. Then we're talking about the big things: rejection, separation, failure, financial trouble. But the biggest of these is death. The thing that most people fear is death above all else. So much so that we'll do anything to distract ourselves from it, and we'll pay big bucks for these fountain of youth products that will keep us alive for as long as we can. For the world, death is scary. It's the great equalizer. Rich or poor, healthy or not, religious or not, everyone will die, myself included, you included. For the world, death is understandably scary. But I'll repeat it. For the Christian, death should not be feared. Really, nothing should be feared. I was listening to a talk by Bishop Barron, and he makes some great points. So as Christians, we lead off with death. The religion that's all about joy, life, fullness, strangely keeps death really close, like oddly close. And think about it. So the very first sacrament of Christian initiation, baptism, right? In fact, baptism is how we're first named Christians. Yes, it cleanses of original sin. That's what most people think of. But realize it or not, baptism is about death. And the early Christians knew this very well. Look at the symbolism. One is immersed under the water to be baptized into Christ's death. The symbolism is that of a grave. We die, we are killed. Even some pastors will kind of keep the head of the person down just a little bit so that they feel the tension of dying, of death. And then what happens? The person is sealed with the sign of the cross, the instrument of Christ's death. So a tool used by the Romans for the worst of criminals and the most excruciating of deaths is what we're marked by. Most of this happens when we're babies, but when we grow older, and we're old enough to dip our hands into the holy water font, these two acts are put together. So we go to the holy water font to remind ourselves of our baptism. What do? We make the sign of the cross. So the two instruments, or the two initiating things, are things of death. Christianity starts with death, believe it or not. But there's no need to fear death, for we have already died. There's no need to fear something that has already taken place. We have already died to sin and death. This is great news. So in reality, should we be reasonably, should we be fearful of certain things? Yes. So should you be afraid of the Nazis? Yeah, probably so. Should you be afraid of the communists? Yeah, probably so. Should you be fearful of a global pandemic? Yeah, sure. But only to an extent. Only to an extent. That's the big caveat. And this is where our first tool comes in. Fortitude. This is super important. So what happens when something that is worthy of our fear comes into play? We have a specific virtue for it. This is fortitude. So fortitude helps us fear in the right proportion. So it's reasonable to fear losing your job, especially right now. It's reasonable to fear if your child is deployed to the Middle East. It's reasonable to fear about his well-being. It's even reasonable to fear a global pandemic, but it shouldn't derail us. It should be put in its proper perspective, and fortitude helps us to do this. So fortitude is the virtue by which one goes for the good firmly. You're firmly rooted in the good, even though you face a difficulty. Okay? So fear is about a future evil that's putting a block, that's impeding a certain good that you're going after. But fortitude is precisely about going after that good, even though you have that future evil before you. Right? So unfortunately, there's evil in the world, right? But as Christians, we can't stop living just because there's a certain evil in front of us. We would never get out of bed in the morning. So virtue, if you look at the board now, virtue is always the mean. It's always the average. It's always in the middle. So if we take temperance, for example, temperance is not about taking no pleasure in anything. That would be the vice of defect. But it's not about eating 20 pounds of cake either, right? Temperance is right in the middle. Drinking the right amount of drink, taking in the right amount of food. Fortitude is the same way, dealing with fear. And the soldier is a great example. So a soldier really needs fortitude. Another word for fortitude is courage. So when the bell rings for battle, and the soldier gets up, what's the vice of defect? What if he doesn't have enough courage? Timidity, fear. He's in the corner in the fetal position and he can't get out. Right? That'd be the vice of defect. What if he goes too far to the excess? Fearlessness. Thomas Aquinas talks about too. Fearlessness, which means you don't have the proper fear that you should have. You're at the battle lines and you're just running out to the enemy and you're going to be taken out immediately. What do you think foolhardiness is? It's a fun one. Foolhardiness is when you have the fear that you should have, but to show off to your friends, you run out in the battle line anyway, just to show that I'm a macho man. A lot of teenage boys have foolhardiness. But fortitude is right in the middle. Courage is right in the middle. It keeps us too hastily from going to the good or from not going to it at all. This is what we need at this time. But we can even go further. So anyone can have this. Anyone can acquire this virtue. But only the Christian can do what really fortitude is after. What do you think that is? What's the chief act of fortitude? Martyrdom. Martyrdom. So true fortitude is going after the good even though you're fearful of death. So it's going after the good even though you're fearful of death. So not even death will stop you. The Christian fears nothing because they're willing to die even for their faith. So what do we get from this? The Christian is best under trial. This is like our bread and butter right now. Right? So we should set ourselves apart by the trials because the Christian knows how to suffer well. This is a wonderful, wonderful verse. If you want to write this on your mirror and read it every morning, this is from James. Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials. For you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance be perfect, so that you may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. Consider it pure joy. Ouch, that hurts, right? Do we consider this time pure joy? You have a long way to go. Ask the great martyrs. So we shouldn't go looking for trials and sufferings, but when they come to us, like coronavirus, the Christian gets out his or her toolbox and we know how to face it, right? We know how to endure well. We aren't derailed, but we get better and we get stronger. The Christian fears nothing because the biggest of all the fears has been conquered. If I don't fear death, what is there to fear? Truly. We're unstoppable. Because by Christ's death, we no longer fear death, but what do? We wear it around our necks. We put it on the door of our homes. We put it on the dashboard of our cars. The cross is everywhere. Because now, because of Christ, and only because of Christ, death is not the end, but it's a door and a victory. So it's a door to new life, and it's a victory over our most fearful enemy, death itself. And hope is that by which we orient our lives to these truths, and which comes to our next tool. This is really what rounds out the Christian response. So fortitude is for specific situations. When a situation arises, a fearful obstacle of death, I can arise with fortitude. But hope is enduring. Hope we get at our baptism. Hope is a staple of the Christian life because hope is a theological virtue. So while fortitude helps us to continue after the good, even though there's a fear of an evil, Hope attaches us to this good. The highest good, the only good that won't be shaken, which is God himself. God himself. And this is why I think the virus is such a great grace, because it shook up our little worlds, and we can still see the nail marks on all the things that we were attached to, all the lesser goods that we were attached to. And little by little, or really overnight, we have to pry ourselves from these lesser attachments. But the hopeful person lost nothing. Why? They lost nothing of value, at least, because they were always attached to the highest good, to God. They weren't attached to these lesser goods. So they don't see the nail marks, or the nail marks on the lesser goods, because they were always attached to Him who is highest. So a virtuous person is self-possessed. They can act in accord with the good at any moment in time. But the hopeful person is possessed by God. Okay? Because the theological virtues, and especially hope, has God as the origin, the motive, and the end. So hope is where I get it from God. It's my reason. God is my reason, and it's the object. It's the end. So God is everything. We can often get this confused, though, with natural hope. So I hope he makes the baseball team this spring. Or I hope the train arrives on time. Or I hope I get that doctorate next year. These are still on the natural level. We're talking about supernatural hope. So what's another example? We use a lot of natural hopes to get us through certain things. So you might look forward to a good meal at the end of the day. So, that good meal, I'm going to have a nice dinner with my husband at Don's or something. That'll get you through the day, right? Maybe a good vacation at the end of the year. Well, if you hope for that vacation, it'll get you through the year. But would a good meal get you through the year? No. Will a good vacation get you through life? No. Only hope in the highest good, God himself, who is our origin, our motive, and our end, will get us through life. Right? This is supernatural hope. Not just natural hope, it's supernatural hope. So the image for hope is usually an anchor, which is perfect with our gospel reading. So when the waves come, I love coronavirus because it supplies the waves. We can put our anchor down, and it makes us steadfast where we are. Another good way, and I think I brought this up in another talk, is if you take that anchor and you throw it at the pearly gates of heaven, and you let St. Peter fasten it to the gates, and you hold it tight, and then you're just pulling yourself throughout life. It's an attachment to God based on the happiness that we know we will get now, and especially in the future. Another good way to look at it is a child with his parent. So if a child is walking down the street with his parent, and it's a nice, beautiful day, everything's in peace, he'll probably have a few feet in front of him. He'll be, lollygagging or whatever, just in bliss. But when a large lightning strikes, or an ambulance comes, or a loud noise, what's going to happen? He's going to grab for that parent. He's going to attach himself to that parent. This is why I think coronavirus is such a grace, because for many of us, we were getting a little too close to that highest good, right? We were getting a little too far away from our Heavenly Father, from our Heavenly Parent. But when these trials hit, that's when the Christian gets back to the basics. And we cling, we attach ourselves back to God, the highest good. So, these virtues, fortitude and hope, and all of them, but especially these tools, which are especially used during trials, are muscles. So they'll only grow stronger if they're put under trial, if they're put under the crucible of trial. So a trial like coronavirus shouldn't decrease your faith, your fortitude, your hope, but precisely the opposite if we have the correct view of it. This is when we exercise it. This is the stuff of which saints are made out of. No saint was born of an easy life. If you read any of them. Just like no bodybuilder gets his physique from raising toothpicks, right? John Paul II isn't a giant of a saint, despite his trials. I named just a few of them in the opening monologue. He's not a saint despite those trials, but especially through them, because he saw them as opportunities to grow in these two things, as well as a plethora of many other virtues. Okay, and we see this in the data too. This is cool. So on April 30th, the Pew Research Center. Now, I would love to see an updated version of this research, but they tested like people's faith, what happened during this pandemic time period. And guess what? 25% of people said their faith actually got stronger. Only 2% said their faith got weaker. Only 2%. And for those who go to church regularly, about 50% said their faith got stronger, compared to about 15% who only went a couple times a year or whatnot. And for those who didn't go at all, I mean, you can imagine the results. It was no change, it got worse. And many others, at least one Gallup poll said the same thing. So what do we get from this? Those who had faith before only got stronger. And those who didn't never had it to begin with. Right? So you can't strengthen something you don't have. So what's the moral of the story? If you want to kill Christianity, take away all the trials. Make life really comfortable. Make it really easy. We're fighters. Christians are fighters. It's in us. At baptism, these things are infused into us. We're fighters. So when the trials come, we only get stronger. But you have to realize that they're muscles to be exercised, and not go to this vice of defect and just cower in a corner like the world's caving in on you. This is our time to shine, in other words. Okay. So fortitude and hope help the Christian to say thank you, in other words. Thank you, God, for the waves. Thank you for bringing me closer to you through this in ways that I never would have been able to through any other way. I needed this trial in order to reattach myself to you. Thank you, Lord. Fortitude helps us endure this evil, while hope attaches us to God and helps us move towards Him. Which just allows us to do the last thing I want to talk about. Both of these things coming together helps us live life on purpose. Live life on purpose. This is a great lesson that we can learn from this whole situation. So you may be saying, well, I thought I was supposed to value life, right? I thought my life was valuable, and now you're telling me to live loose and reckless and that I shouldn't fear death. What's this about? Not at all. Not at all. I'm not telling you to live on this side. I'm telling you to live in the middle, just like the saints did. So it's not like, come at me, virus. I'm not afraid of you. Come at me. No, it's detaching ourselves from all these worldly enjoyments so that you can actually enjoy them as they should be enjoyed. So in other words, by letting go of this fear of death, you can finally live. You can finally live as we're meant to. So we value life to the fullest when we understand that our life is in the hands of another. So Lord, if you want to take me now, take me. I wasn't expecting it. But I know that death is not the end. It is a door and it is a victory. It is a door and it is a victory. I'm not going to cower in a corner, but I'm not going to go to the vice of excess and go to these COVID parties without a mask and whatever. I'm going to live the Christian life just as I would before, in the middle, in the mean, in virtue. So there's a Pope Alexander, and I forget the number behind, like the 7th maybe. He kept a coffin in his room. Whether you realize that. Like in the Vatican, he kept a coffin in his room. So the first thing he saw when he woke up was a coffin. The last thing he saw before he went to bed was a coffin. He kept death really, really close. I'm not saying I recommend this. But he faced death head on. He wasn't afraid of it. He was able to live freely. Death wasn't something constricting to him, but what? A door and a victory. And it can be the same for us. When we face this fear, this anxiety, this worry, this out-of-control feeling, try to live life on purpose. Don't let the waves, don't let the world dictate to you how to live, but rather your faith. So look at all that you do in life and ask yourself, am I doing this just because it's what you do? because everybody else is doing it, because the Joneses are doing it, so I got to keep up with the Joneses, right? Is this in accord with who I am? This goes back to our second week talk. So maybe you found that you actually liked life post-quarantine. I know many people have said, like, I like not going to all the baseball tournaments. It was nice. I could actually live life on purpose. So I recommend not to lose that. Part of the grace of quarantine is, like I said, detaching us from all those extra things so that we can take a good look at them when we're attached to that which we should be attached to. And these tools will certainly help us. So now we can wrap up this series. So let's go back to our gospel from Matthew, which we started out with. So we started this series talking about this disorders. We discovered this mess within us. Then we looked at the root of all these disorders. So it was many times it's a lack of understanding of who we are at our core. Remember the onion? We peeled the skin of the onion. Last week we looked at one of those uncomfortable disorders, sitting by ourselves in silence. So what could we say in other words? Our boats were filled with a lot of mess. Our boats were filled with a lot of mess, in other words. The boat seemed fine for a while, as long as the seas were calm, right? We were able to handle everything. But just like the disciples, it took a storm to remind us what was actually in the boat, what was actually in our boat. So when the waves came, we looked around at each other, and I can just see the disciples looking around at themselves. I'm sure Matthew looked at John, and then John looked at Andrew, and then Andrew looked at whoever else was in the boat, and they said, "Oh, crap. They can't help me. He certainly can't help me. He can't do anything." And then what happened? They remembered that Christ was with them. He was sleeping in the bow. He was quietly sleeping. So thank God for the storm, because the storm reminds us that Christ is in the boat with us. There's nothing to fear. Like I said before, your dad owns the world. Do not be afraid. So the storm that is around you doesn't have to be within you. And I want to share something that came to me in prayer. As I was preparing this talk this weekend, and I was reading this, and I don't know why. I just chose this. I thought it was a good gospel passage to kind of explain what I wanted to talk about, the experience of trial. And one of the detriments of reading Scripture is you can focus in on one little word or just one little passage. But when you broaden your eyes, you really see something. And this is what I saw. So before the calming of the storm in Matthew's Gospel, there's all these healings right before it. All these healings. Then there's the calming of the storm, and it's followed by all these healings. And then finally the call of Matthew. This is often how the spiritual life works. So the Lord shows us who He is oftentimes. He coaxes us like the lover that He is. He coaxes us. He comes. It's like courting a girl in dating. And then what happens? He brings that love to trial, and He purifies it. This is always necessary in the spiritual life. And then after you realize that the Lord was always with you, He reaffirms that love. And then what happens? He always calls you to a deeper discipleship. He always calls you to a deeper discipleship. So there's the showing of who the Lord is. This is who I am. And then He rebukes His would-be followers because they're not ready for it. I think that's perfect. Then if you read the gospel passage again, it's Jesus Himself who gets in the boat, and then His disciples follow Him. He knew what He was doing the whole time. He brings you into a trial, and then He reaffirms His love for you, always to bring you back into a deeper call, a deeper discipleship. And I think this is a wonderful way to look at this virus. This is what we've been talking about for a month now, for four weeks. The virus is a trial. It's difficult. It might be more difficult for some of us more than others. It did uncover some disorder, some mess. That's a good thing. If we remember who we are, and we remember who's in the boat, nothing else matters. Truly, nothing else matters. Death is a door. It's a victory. It's not something to fear. So in the words of John Paul II, do not be afraid. Open the doors wide to Christ. So thank you. I really enjoyed this. Thank you guys.